Welcome back, everybody, in Social 30. We're going to carry on our mini lecture series on the idea of progressivism. So last class, we were looking at this idea of this transition, the start of this transition from a classical liberal society to more modern liberalism through the introduction of progressive ideas. So we're going to pick it right back up. I'm just going to flip the screen here so that you can see what I'm talking about. And we'll be ready to go. So what we're going to look at is this idea of post-World War I returning to normalcy, then the Great Depression, and some of the reforms brought out in the Great Depression in the United States specifically. So this idea of return to normalcy, right? The First World War brought upon a lot of change, a lot of manufacturing in various countries, including the United States and Canada, in order to ramp up production for the war. When the war ends and everybody comes home, what you start to see is this idea of war return to normalcy, where you see nations becoming to the point where they're starting to isolate themselves again, right? Retreating from foreign affairs, from interacting with other countries and interfering with other countries. This idea of nativism, the promotion of policies that favor a specific dominant culture in a country, reducing immigration, and a scaling back or a reduction in the amount of government intervention in society, in the lives of citizens. So those were the three kind of central pieces of President Warren Harding's policies in the United States in 1921. Very pro-business, trying to re-stimulate the economy, but in a different way. We see Calvin Coolidge assumed the presidency in 1923 in the United States, being very fiscally conservative, believing that government intervention should be very limited, but he did hold progressive beliefs like women's suffrage, right? Women did not have a significant role in civil society outside of the home prior to the war, right? And they really get pulled into civil society when the men go off to war. And then he does continue to support this idea of women's suffrage beyond the war. Some of the things that we see Coolidge do, we see the reduction of personal income taxes, right? So the government's pulling in less money from personal income tax. We see different policies that he implements reflect his belief in laissez-faire capitalism, this belief that that America was strong and exceptional and the American dream, and really believed in this policy of of isolationism. And this is reflected in the years immediately following the war, right, with the fall, with Wilson getting ousted from power and the United States not joining the League of Nations that you would have talked about last year, right? This isolationist foreign policy that leave Europe to itself. We don't need to get involved there again. That's that bottom bullet there. So what we see, and you may have heard of it before, this idea of the Roaring 20s. After the war, when a lot of nations in Europe start to struggle and they're rebuilding, the United States really had a great deal of equality. Now, we'll have to kind of qualify that equality in the sense that there was still tremendous inequality, race inequality, income inequality, depending on who you were and where you lived. But there was more opportunity, so equality of opportunity rather than equality of circumstance, right? Because we know there's tremendous discrimination around the United States and Canada. But this idea that because of a lack of government intervention, in theory, everyone should have a chance at attaining prosperity through the pursuit of their self-interest, right? But that idea of the American dream, right? If you work hard, you could achieve it. So this idea of meritocracy. We see a tremendous shift, right? Factories during the war had ramped up production to support the war effort, and this is now shifting back to the production of consumer goods. And the economy grew and grew and grew quite rapidly until 1929, when the stock market crashed. We see the dramatic increase of consumerism, right? The people buying consumer product, right? Not only their needs, but also their wants. And as a result, this free market economy is expanding rapidly. It's modernizing rapidly, and major changes are occurring. But this isn't going to be sustainable. Right? So the industrial expansion of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, you're looking at that industrial revolution that takes place in Britain, but also in other countries around the world, including the United States. You see tremendous income disparity, right? That difference between the rich and the poor and how much money they are making, right? The exploitation of the working class really is hallmarked in that industrial revolution that you've already talked about. Following that period of time in the 20s, right, this prosperity, we delve into the severe depression of the 1930s. And this would have tremendous long-lasting influences on democratic governments around the world. And it is really the Great Depression that is going to introduce massive progressive and social interventions that produce our current idea of liberalism. So the Greatest Depression and the longest recession in modern world history, right? It lasts pretty close to darn near a decade. So how does it all start? So the stock market crashes on Tuesday, October 29th, 1929. And remember, prices had rapidly risen in the 20s, right? The stock market was growing and growing and growing. People started buying stock like crazy. People started taking out loans to buy stock. The problem with that, once that stock price drops, you still owe the bank that money, and now you don't have any way to pay it. So prices start dropping, and the prices begin to fall. Investors started to take the profit, right? Kind of like if you've seen any of the movies related to the stock market. I can't think of the name off the top of my head, of course. The Big Short, right? So companies are starting to sparking profit taking, right? They're selling. Panicked sellers are trading all of their shares, right? 4 times the normal volume at any time. And what we see is a massive stock market crash on October the 29th. Black Tuesday is often what it's referred to as the start of the Great Depression. Now, it's important to note that the stock market crashed, but what makes this more difficult to manage is the fact that there is also a massive drought. So that's going to have agricultural impacts. And that has tremendous impact as well, and it cannot be forgotten. So why does Black Tuesday matter? You can see on the grid or on the chart over here, right? You've got in the late 20s, right? Really huge. This is the Dow Jones stock market, right? Huge climbs, huge climbs, and then a big drop, and then further drops. Bit of a tiny, edge up, and then another drop, and another drop, and another drop, and another drop. And there is no government intervention at this point, really, until it hits those lowest of lows. So you have the end of optimism and confidence in the economy come Black Tuesday. Investors really looked at the stock market to see how healthy the economy was, and it's crashing and crashing and crashing. Isolationism led to high taxes being put on goods coming in from other markets, so import items, which makes those items much more expensive. And so now you have a very unstable market. And now in the aftermath, right, you had these investors that I'd mentioned that had borrowed money to buy stocks. Well, now not only do they have massive debt, they have stock that is worthless and they're struggling to pay it. You've coupled with the volume of people that have done that. Now, banks aren't raking in any money, many of which are calling in these loans because they don't have any money either. So what you see is many people overextended, declaring personal bankruptcy or corporate bankruptcy. And so people fear that the little bit of money that they did have, that the banks might take them. So people started to do what's called bank runs, where they would go to the bank and they try to withdraw all their money. But of course, if too many people try to withdraw their savings from a time, at the same time, it causes that financial institution to go bankrupt. So we see banks going bankrupt. So, right, if a bank goes bankrupt and a business had borrowed from them, well, now that business is done too because they have nowhere to borrow their money from anymore. So, factors that contribute to this recession, right? There's a number of factors that all kind of line up at the same time. Some economists believe that industry and agriculture was just too strong. It had become too productive, too good. As a result, you have this massive amount of products on the market, and now they're all falling in prices. The tariffs that we've already mentioned, these taxes on imports in order to protect the local economies, right? That further slowed the global economy. The idea that you have a loss of confidence in the economy itself. So you've got people spending even less money. And that's going to slow the economy down, right? When people don't have money to spend and it's not getting spent, that slows the economy down. And we're starting to see that right now in Canada and in North America and around the world with our COVID-19 crisis. North American farmers, as I mentioned, they get hit by droughts and an insect plague. So the crops are suffering as well. So, historical importance of the Great Depression itself. Okay, banks went broke when the stock markets crashed. Businesses cut back their hours or laid people off. Shanty towns, right? People need places to live. So you see these slums or ghettos made out of driftwood, cardboard, newspaper, right? People trying to just make makeshift homes. President Roosevelt, we're looking to look at President Franklin Roosevelt. We're going to look at his ideas here in a few minutes, looking at relief, recovery, and reform, or the New Deal. We're going to get to that here in a little bit. But this idea of the introduction of social welfare programs. Uncontrolled capitalism, right? Prior to the Great Depression, that idea of uncontrolled laissez-faire capitalism had huge devastating effects once this depression hit. A lot of jobs had been created both for soldiers in the manufacturing industry, but also for other people that were replacing men that had gone off to fight the war. Well, now you have a massive workforce that is all unemployed, the soldiers coming back and the people that had taken those jobs while they were gone. So the Great Depression, in terms of modern liberalism, is really considered to be the beginning of the modern welfare state, as we call it. Okay? It is deemed no longer acceptable for governments to sit back and do nothing when people are suffering. But the Great Depression doesn't start with intervention. It takes years for this intervention to come. This idea that the government needs to help regulate the economy to prevent problems. That can be done by increasing or decreasing interest rates to help stimulate or slow investment. Provide social safety net for its citizens, right? We're looking at stuff like old age security, employment insurance, those types of things. This idea that the government must prime the pump. So that would mean stimulating the economy by investing in infrastructure projects potentially, or Keynesian economics. And we're going to be looking at that in another section later when we get to talking about economics. So ultimately what we see is people during the Great Depression looking towards more socialist type ideas, right? More extreme government intervention for solutions to some of these problems. And Roosevelt's New Deal in the United States was designed to help these Americans get through the Great Depression. Now, Canada has its own program that we'll look at a little bit later through an activity. Ultimately speaking, it's called for social programs, pensions, employment insurance, in order to get people working again and spending money again. Because if people have money, they are going to spend it. So let's talk about, just briefly, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. So the Depression, right, the stock market crashes in 1929. It takes 3.5 to 4 years for governments to promise action. Think about that. 4 years of lack of assistance. That is devastating to a lot of people. So come 1933, this New Deal that was promised was a series of programs and projects during the Great Depression over a series of years, ultimately speaking, in an attempt to restore prosperity. It attempts to stabilize the economy, provides jobs and relief to those who are suffering. And over the next 8 years, a series of experimental New Deal projects and programs, because remember, classical liberalism had existed and there had been no intervention for governments to kind of look to historically to see what types of interventions might help this situation. Ultimately speaking, Roosevelt's New Deal and actions taken in Canada as well permanently changed the landscape of democracies and the role of government in society and the economy. So, how does this work? In terms of the banks, okay, um, right, we know that there's a banking crisis, okay, and so what Roosevelt does is he declares a bank holiday, as in we're closing all the banks in order to stop people from withdrawing their money from banks that may be teetering on the brink of bankruptcy themselves. He passes an Emergency Banking Act, which basically says the bank and the closed ones that were insolvent would recognize which banks were closed and which ones were insolvent, so had gone bankrupt. 3 days later, he comes back and says, please, America, put your money back in the bank. By the end of that month, 3/4 of the banks had reopened. So in his first 100 days, what happens? Oh, let's just make that a bit smaller so we can see the top of that one. So he introduces a sweeping farm relief bill. Okay? And this bill basically prevents crop surpluses, right, which leads to lower prices, right? So it's trying to stabilize the prices. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, or the AAA, called for government to pay farmers not to plant. So subsidizing farmers, saying we're going to pay you, but we don't want you to plant. We just need things to stabilize. Of course, there were still some farmers planting in order to provide food for Americans. FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, he pushes for large-scale welfare and public works programs. Okay? And he does this through the creation of many programs, including the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC, basically where they hire thousands of young people, so in the CCC's case, 250,000 young people, to plant trees and fix up national parks. Right? So these are make work projects. So instead of just giving people money, people were working for their money, but also helping along the way. It allocates about $3.3 billion. Think about that in the context of the 1930s in terms of volume of cash, to put unemployed people to work in various government jobs across the country. And this later grows into a much larger jobs program. Back to his 100 days, right? This is his first 100 days in office since taking over the presidency. He imposes regulations for the first time in the stock market, rules regulating how the stock market will operate. Securities Act, so that's related to the stock market, right? So this idea of disclosing information. More banking laws that will separate investments and savings, right? Investments as in stock market. Little more that after 3 months, basically, he had created a new America in the way things had operated. You have now tremendous government intervention in society. More rounds come through, right? Remember, this is over the course of about 8 years that this occurs. But the Great Depression does not go away despite all of the reforms we've already mentioned. And there are many, okay? And the activity that you're going to do this week, looking at the Great Depression compared to COVID, is going to have you identify different things that different countries are doing, both in the Great Depression and our current crisis. You still see in Roosevelt's America in the 1930s, unemployment, unstable economy, right? The farmers suffering through this drought. People are desperate. So he launches a second New Deal, providing more jobs for those unemployed, building post offices, bridges, schools, right? Public infrastructure projects that are going to put people back to work. In addition, so in part stimulating the economy, but also creating stuff that you're going to need down the road. Creates the Wagner Act, the National Relations Board to supervise unions and elections and prevent businesses from treating their workers unfairly. The development of unemployment insurance. This is a huge development, and this is something that will stay the course throughout modern history in democratic states like the United States, like Canada, like Europe. And that's where we're going to pause it for today. Next day, we'll come back with our third and last lecture in the series of the effects of all of the things that we've just been talking about. We're going to flip back over. Stop this presentation. So, hope you learned a little bit, and next time we'll talk about the impacts.